introduce an Imperial College graduate, which I often do, but this is one I'm particularly pleased to do, in that she graduated around 2000. I can't remember, Libby. When was it?
It was 2002, I think.
2002.
Yeah.
So she managed to avoid ever being taught by me anything useful anyhow. Before that, before she ever got to Imperial, she'd been involved in space schools and writing. I picked up on Wikipedia, I think, that you'd written a travel guide to Mars very early on as a 7-year-old. I think that's a remarkable achievement. After Imperial, she went to Cranfield University for a master's degree. And following that, she went to work for the company, was at the time called EADS Astrium, and now is called Airbus UK, I think. And from there, she went to the most exciting part of her career at the time, I think. She went to work at the European Control Center for the International Space Station. And it's called the Columbus Control Center. It's in Germany. And she was looking after the astronauts. And of course, shortly after, this was probably around 2010, shortly after that, she took over responsibility for looking after Tim Peake. And in my view, if you wanted to find the person in the United Kingdom who knows most about being an astronaut, you might think of nominating Tim Peake. To be honest, I think you should nominate Libby. I suspect, having been in her managerial role of looking after astronauts, she really knows an enormous amount. She's, I think, very well known for communication. And until very recently, she was head of space exploration for the UK Space Agency. And I think that is probably enough about, I probably missed out whole sections of your life, Libby, because, but really, we're delighted to have you here today. It's our chance to really learn from the horse's mouth, if that's not quite the right word, but about how UK and how space exploration fit together, mainly through the European Space Agency, I guess. But first, you've got a new job coming up. And do you want to tell us all what it is?
I'm so excited. You know, people asked me when I was a flight director over in Germany, as you said, oh, what are you going to do next? It was, being a flight director was my dream job. And then I couldn't believe that I got to go to the UK Space Agency and be right at the heart of Tim Peake's mission, UK British astronaut, which I have to say, I grew up not expecting to see British astronauts fly, because way back when it was not government policy to support these things. So to then be in charge of it was still mind-blowing. And people would ask me, well, where do you go next? And I'd say, I don't know. And I didn't know. But I now have a new job. It was announced yesterday. I start in a couple of weeks. I'm delighted. I'm coming back to South Kensington. And I will be next door to Imperial College because I'm joining the Science Museum as their head of space. And will bring so many different things together that I enjoy doing. Telling stories, telling to everybody the power of space and what it can do for everybody back on Earth, how it can capture people's imaginations. And really, I hope to inspire the next generation of young people in the way that gallery, the Space Gallery, which is closing soon. If you haven't seen it, really go see that before it gets closed and it's being replaced. But that Space Gallery in the Science Museum was one of my earliest memories. And when I was a student at Imperial, I'd pop in there in the lunch break and think what an amazing space it was. So I'm really excited for my next chapter in life, which is about to start.
Well, it's very exciting. Well, I'll be looking forward to seeing you back in South Kensington. And indeed, a lot of the people online here have lived not so far from South Kensington or very familiar with it. And we'll look forward to what happens in the museum. That's really exciting.
Mm.
Can we perhaps start by, you've been managing astronauts, which is probably not as much fun as being an astronaut, but in a sense is even more important than being an astronaut. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what exactly you did, what exactly one does controlling the ISS?
To me, I have to say, I think my life working alongside astronauts has been a lot more fun and a lot more interesting, actually, than the general life of an astronaut. The thing about astronauts, people get very excited by them. But this part that they really see is that mission to space, which is for 6 months, which is an amazing experience. And believe me, if you offered me a ticket, I'd go and I'd love to experience it. But that 6 month experience in space involves sleeping in a sleeping bag. There's no shower. It's smelly. You can't have any clean clothes on. It's really camping in quite some extreme ways. And of course, you only do that for 6 months. And I've had 20 years of doing all sorts of amazing things. Back in mission control, the job of everyone is really to be there. You're there around the clock. There's 3 shifts a day, and making sure that this amazing space station and the people who are in it, and they're all, to my mind, sort of living, breathing things. Machines can have lives of their own just as much as humans can, in my mind. And we're there every day. We have a plan. The astronauts, with so much work goes into it to work out what the astronauts will do every day. A meticulous plan that's been put together over years, all coming down to tomorrow. They will do this experiment and that experiment, and they'll do this exercise, and they'll go and do this live video link up, and so on. And on a good day, we just let them all get on with it, and we're there to answer questions and nudge them along and keep on top of things. But when it really counts, I think, is when things go wrong, and you're there to problem solve. You're there to support the crew, to keep them safe, to keep the space station safe, and then to keep the mission going with the science that's taking place. And so, yeah, everything's fine until it's not, and then you're there and you put all your training into practice, all of your thinking to solve the problem, to rearrange the day and whatever needs to happen, to move to other pieces of equipment to keep this amazing space station flying. And you really have a ringside seat into all the fantastic science that's being done up there, the technology that's tested, and the pictures are beautiful. But for me, it is that living and working in space that teaches us so much about how we live and work, the science that can be done. And I always really enjoy sharing those stories, because it inspires so many people to see space. It's not just about the astronauts, it's about so much more than just the astronauts. And I love that they can open and they can shine a spotlight really on the much wider world that space offers everybody.
Since you've worked with so many astronauts, in fact, Tim, obviously you know extremely well, but you're in that team at ESA's control center. You must have come across a large number. What exactly? And it's the job in ESA that gets the most applications. The Director General last time got about 20 applications. When they asked for astronauts, they got 20,000 applications or some such number. What is it? How on earth does one sort down to the very few who are going to make it? Tell us about what makes an astronaut.
Well, to go through that selection, it's a whole series of rounds. The European Space Agency do it very well. And I think, to just touch on why, how many other sort of pinnacles, job applicants like that, opportunities are there where there's a public call? Would you like to go and be a professional footballer? Would you like to go and be an Oscar-winning actor? I know of no other really high-profile, exciting role where anyone can apply, and then people are trained specifically for that role without come up through ranks of Formula One racing or leagues of football or something. And so I think that's why, because it really captures everyone. And how the European Space Agency do it is really through a series of rounds. You start off with an application form and you lay out your CV and your qualities and why you'd be good, and that takes you from something like 20,000 down to a few thousand people. And then they work through a series of tests that check on the skills, your number, reasoning skills, your fine motor skills, all of these things that you really can't teach people in particularly. You just, it is in your genetic makeup, or it is something you're good at or not doing. And then they look at people, weeds out some more, then they look at people in groups and see how they work in a social dynamic. Are they team players? Are they able to take the lead? How do they work in those groups? There's medical screening that is done, because to put somebody into space is years and years of training. It's hugely expensive, but the missions are 6 months long on the International Space Station. You really don't want to get up there and be a month in and then suddenly get sick and have to fly not just you, but your crew members back down to Earth and interrupt the mission. And of course, if that's what had to be done, you would do it, but it's all about minimizing the risk. And so you're trying to find people who are the least risky people to send into space. And all of that goes through, and they're left with about 20 or 30 people, and then it's into a traditional interview round, just as it is for anybody else, and the right people are chosen. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt, every single one of the astronauts that the European Space Agency have selected, both in this round and the round that Tim was in back in 2012, they're all just lovely people, fundamentally, but they've got qualities. They're calm under pressure. They're incredibly able to absorb lots of information. They're great on the camera. They've got all these different things, because being an astronaut is truly, so really are a jack of all trades, and then usually a master of most of them as well. But I think the thing that people also don't realize, which comes back into what's it like working alongside astronauts in a managerial capacity, they are very much tokens and players in a much wider political, economic negotiation that is always taking place between the European Space Agency and its member states, who flies and so on. People often ask, how much does an astronaut flight cost? Well, the UK never pays a cash price for an astronaut. There is no single line where you can sign up with the European Space Agency and say, I'll have a ticket to space, please. You can do that through SpaceX and a whole number of other people. The UK could today decide to spend about $50 million, send it over to the States, give it to SpaceX, and any astronaut could go to space for a couple of weeks. But instead, the way the European Space Agency is set up is that we invest money in the European Space Agency. Our companies then in the UK build contracts that are all part of the exploration program in this case. And part of that exploration program is a barter between the European Space Agency and NASA, and that's what secures the astronaut flight. So there's never a price to be paid. It's just a cherry on the top. And I often think of human spaceflight in particular as a sort of a KPI or a sign of how well the space program is doing overall, because we could talk for hours about the pros and the cons, and many people have views on human spaceflight and should we be doing it. But I sometimes think of, something, you see how people's own economies are going, and people like status symbols and so on, and sometimes an astronaut is just that sign that you're able to put enough funding in to your space sector as a whole that you can then afford to go and do human spaceflight on top.
Yeah, I knew space. I mean, I've known astronauts for a long time, and it seemed to me that it's changed. That is, the original right stuff was not quite enough. Is that your? I mean, I've met some of the people who landed on the moon, for example, and they were rather different to. I mean, nowadays astronauts have softer edges, if you like. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I absolutely. I agree with that. And the role has changed. Back in the 1960s, the first few cohorts of astronauts, particularly that NASA and the Soviet Union selected when we were just learning how to do that, they were chosen as test pilots. And that was, I think, absolutely right, because what you were doing was putting a human on top of an exploding bomb that we didn't really know what was going to happen to it. And you needed a certain kind of person who was used to that level of risk and so on. And the best place to look were the people who were used to pushing experimental aircraft to their limits and understand the risks to their lives of sitting in those vehicles. And that now was, now some 60 years ago. And we now are in a place where there is absolutely still risk. And everybody who gets on those rockets understands that. Everybody who's working in mission control and around understands those risks. It's part of that great selection process that we were talking about. But it's not a two-week test flight. It's a 6-month living and working in space. And that requires a different personality, really, and a different way of looking at the world. To survive in a close environment, 7 people on the International Space Station, size of about a 5-bedroom house. You really can't go for a walk anywhere. No escape. Say very limited food. You have to be someone who is able to go with the flow somewhat, rather than a different personality who knows what they're doing and is a great test pilot. Not to say test pilots can't be great astronauts. Look at Tim Peake for starters.
Yes, no. Well, of course, perhaps the most troubling thing is the idea that the personality of astronauts might change again if all you've got to have is $50 million and you can become an astronaut. It's a bit of a different story, but perhaps we'll come to that later. Listen, the long-term goal, okay, we have astronauts in low Earth orbit. Maybe very soon we'll see astronauts in the vicinity of the moon. But honestly, for the last 60 years, I think if you'd asked what the ultimate goal for astronauts was, it wasn't to go to the moon. That's a staging post. It was to go, well, to the one planet where you could easily envisage perhaps an astronaut at least not being wiped out by the arrival, but
exactly.
So Mars. Is that still the goal that you would envisage?
Yeah, I think that is it is defined in something called the Global Exploration Roadmap, which is a document that agencies around the world have laid out. And that is still a long-term horizon goal of exploration. And for me, it stems from what makes us human. And it's been there for so long, just because you look up there and it is the planet, and it is a sister planet, a cousin planet. Of all the planets in the solar system, it's the one that you can most think was habitable. It was why I wrote that travel guide to Mars when I was 7, because I was imagining that in my lifetime, I might see it. And the film The Martian does a great job in the book, indeed, I think, of putting into play really how theoretically tantalizingly close achievable it is. I have no doubt humans will go to Mars. And I, in fact, was giving a talk at a school this morning, and I said to the kids, and I believe it, I think they will see humans on Mars in their lifetime. And I hope I will see humans on Mars in my lifetime, because it is just that human challenge. But why do you do it? And it costs a lot. What do you get from it? For me, it is the challenge and the seeking to accomplish that by pushing that, humanity will learn things along the way. It will develop new technologies. It will understand things we can't even know at the moment because we haven't gone on that journey. By going on that journey, we will discover things, and we'll sort of fulfill our destiny as humanity to keep exploring.
Would it be economically significant? I mean, sure, there's a sort of forced technology that always has lots of spin-off, but are we going to get to Mars, and are we going to find something economically important? You were almost suggesting it was almost philosophically important or culturally important.
I don't know what we will find, and for me, that's it. It's always worth remembering, in the cost of exploration, it costs a lot, but it doesn't cost anything like as much as everything else that the government spends money on. One of my favorite comparisons, I don't know that they were pleased by it, but I gave a talk to some engineers once, and I drew comparisons between the cost of Crossrail and High Speed 2 in the International Space Station. And I can't remember the numbers now, but I'm pretty sure High Speed 2, of course, has ballooned and ballooned and ballooned to many billions.
Yeah, High Speed 2 is somewhere north of 60 billion.
Yes, and the International Space Station, not the UK, not the European Space Agency, but the whole thing was 100 billion. And it just, you can put it, to put High Speed 2 in alongside the whole cost of the International Space Station, and then what the UK spends on exploration, never mind what it spends on space, but what it spends on exploration is about 50 million a year. In total, including what we subscribe to the European Space Agency. What we spend on space as a whole, it's gone up, but it's something like 600-700 million. It's not £1 billion per year. And so you put it in context of the 60 billion and so on, but what it delivers to absolutely everybody is to me, I don't think always understood. I think people think that exploration is much more expensive than it is relative to everything else. But none of that money that we put in space, we're not stacking it in the moon or so. It's all creating jobs and economies here on Earth. And it's developing R&D and technologies. One of the things that the exploration program invested in is the European Space Agency's Mars rover, which will go and look for signs of life on Mars, which we need to do, right? We have to scientifically go and understand Mars and the possibility that life was there, is there, before we go and trample all over it with human life and ruin kind of all the scientific beauty and amazingness of that. So we have to go and understand life on Mars. But one of the technology spin-outs was in really helped with aluminium can manufacturing. And they came up with, I think, a new way of thinning the material or a manufacture that has then spun out and saved loads in transport costs because aluminium cans have got lighter. And no one could have predicted that UK investments in Mars rovers was going to help the drinks industry. But indeed it did. And it's, so for me, yes, this journey to Mars, we'll learn things along the way. I am not good at predicting the far, far, far flung future and sort of imagining the likes of some others and the colonies and so on. Living on Mars is hard work, and living out on space is hard work. We've managed the International Space Station. I can see scientific bases on the moon. I could see a scientific base maybe on Mars, but I struggle with the technology leaps that will get us to colonies on Mars. But really the point is who knows? Until you go and try and find out, you don't know what you're going to find and you don't know what you're going to learn.
Yeah, I can really buy that. But let me ask you a tricky question. Well, I hope my questions have been tricky anyhow, but I think there could be something going on under the surface of Mars, at least right now. I mean, the measurement of things like methane, formaldehyde, and quite complex organic things that you could make complicated organic beings out of are seen in the Martian atmosphere. They've come from somewhere and presumably not from space. What is it? There's always this terrible idea that when the astronauts land on the surface, there's a little green man underneath that gets crushed. And so the first thing you find is that there was life before you arrived. I mean, how do you deal with the aspect that, the minute that people arrive on Mars, we'll start changing Mars, perhaps in a way that is alien to whatever was going to develop there?
Well, when we will, and that is inevitable, and life across planet Earth, the very being of life on Earth changes planet Earth. The very being of humans shapes planet Earth. And it's true of any species. It is how evolution and how life works. And for me, humans, with all of our knowledge and curiosity and intelligence, are able to appreciate that there may be life on Mars, and so we shouldn't go and disturb it. And that to me is why it's so important that we have all the rover missions, the planetary protection in space now, to go and try and unravel these questions. And once we've unraveled them, we can then make that decision about how do we treat Mars and so on. And is there stuff there to be mined? And I think inevitably you will see two sides to that argument. We want it in Antarctica, or the scientists essentially want it in Antarctica, and have protected Antarctica as this scientific, inhospitable place that we go on. And now, of course, it's being challenged with people who can see the ice caps melting, and there's oil to be had from underneath it, and so on. I personally am sad that I don't think there was such a debate on the moon, and we're going after the resources on the moon, and humans are going to the moon, and the science perhaps maybe getting sidelined. And we've changed the moon's scientific structure already. There are people who are studying some of the sort of minuscule atmospheres that are there who are saying this has all changed. I would like to see more debate on that subject. I don't know with Mars what will win first and where we will get there. But I do know that already, there are areas of Mars where people think there's more likely to be life and less likely to be life. And you would like to hope that when the planners are there and that the decisions are made, that perhaps the first mission to Mars with humans is more about proving the concept and looking at the geology and avoiding those areas where we think there might be life under the surface.
Let's go back to the moon for a minute, because it really looks as if there is a possibility of seeing people on the moon. But Europe is going with the US in sort of a kind of, not exactly directly, to building a station on the moon, which is always what I imagined would be the first thing to do. But they're thinking of building a space station, a gateway to the moon. Why did you tell us about that? Because you are going to see that in your lifetime, unless you're very, very unlucky.
Well, Gateway is not even being thought about. Gateway is built. All the modules are well on their way to being built, and the first launches are expected in the next few years. And I think it's one of the questions around US space policy. We've had the change of administration. Trump has come in. We might speak more about that in a bit. But for now, the Gateway is there. The missions are scheduled. And the Lunar Gateway will be in orbit around the moon before the end of this decade, and be designed as a staging post for the missions down to the surface of the moon, and for Artemis. So I think there is benefit to the Gateway as a useful staging post. Space stations are easier to maintain than a small vehicle that's going to hop to and from the lunar surface. So I hope it survives any changes to architecture. But of course, the more you build in space, the more you have to operate it and the more costs there are. And that's it's another space station to keep running. The plan for the Lunar Gateway is not that it's permanently inhabited like the International Space Station, but you have missions that are 1, 2, 3 months long. And the Gateway and the missions down to the surface of the moon, but even the Gateway, is about learning how to live and work in deep space. The International Space Station, relatively speaking, is pretty easy. It's a 10-minute ride there and back. Anything goes wrong, you can get home. And crucially, it's inside the magnetic field of the Earth. So you're protected from the solar wind. Once you get out to the moon, you're out in that solar wind. The radiation levels increase massively. And for humans, that's not a good thing. And if we are ever to achieve this ambition of a scientific base or any kind of human presence on the moon, and certainly all the way to Mars one day, that's something we've got to figure out. And the Gateway will be part of that learning.
Yes, well, there's been a couple of movies recently where the idea is if you're going to exploit things like the moon or space or whatever, you need fairly replaceable people. There's a new movie coming out called Mickey 17, for example, and was a terrific movie probably about 10 years ago called, I don't know, Moon or something like that. But are we going to have to modify people?
I mean, people evolve and so on. And it's a very interesting question coming back to the astronaut selection. and the medical screening. And there's arguments on both sides. It is something that is discussed occasionally. If do you want to find the people who are genetically more radiation hardened, essentially, because they're the right people to send, because they're less likely to get sick? Already we don't send astronauts. The astronaut selection process for those long duration missions is you can be excluded on a number of medical grounds. And it's a question that will be debated, and the doctors and the medical community will look at that. I don't be surprised if we start modifying people, but we may want to choose the people who have got the best chance of surviving, because you want to give everybody the best chance of survival when you put them on these very dangerous and arduous missions.
Okay, I'm not sure we aren't going to modify people. I seem to remember Elon Musk recently trying modifying someone, but that's we should probably hold that for another day. I should say, I'm going to ask you another question in a minute, but I should remind everybody that we're going to move over to making them, everybody who's on the call, making them take part in this by asking questions. And the simplest way to put a question up is to write a question into the chat, which is somewhere on the bottom of your screen, I trust, and it says chat. And I think if you open that up, you can put questions in. So you can be thinking about that now, because in about 5-10 minutes time, we'll be letting you take the floor. Well, I'll be letting you take the floor. I'm not going to let Libby off the hook. But so let me ask you a sort of, because I think this sort of thing is really, there's a philosophical, cultural aspect, which you've brought up from time to time. What if we were to find either at Mars, which is clearly the most likely place in our solar system for alternative forms of life? Of course, there are other places in the solar system, in the moons of Saturn or Jupiter. And there are so many planets outside our solar system that it would be very odd if there wasn't life elsewhere, but we don't know it yet. What do you think really, how do you think the world would change? Because I think, it's almost it's a mind-blowing thing, this fact that humanity isn't the only end of evolution possible. Do you have any comments about that, or thoughts? You must have thought about it in the sort of jobs you've had.
In a day-to-day world, that gets into, I think, the good philosophy and scientific thinking that I left my scientific thinking behind when I left Imperial, and realized I was never going to be an actual scientist. I enjoy speaking about it and working with scientists, but I'm never going to be a scientist. But for me, to me, it's obvious there's life out there. We just have to find it. So what's interesting is when we have that confirmation, and I think we will find that confirmation within my lifetime, in the solar system, elsewhere. Every star we look around has planets. It's just, and it has to. So I think there's Mars, there's Enceladus, there's a number of different places on the space in the solar system where we think the conditions are right. So I don't know. It will then may drive a whole. I think what would change is once we have that knowledge, it may then drive a whole new desire and research to go and try and capture that life or learn more about it, and just sort of see where our evolutionary journey and curiosity takes us. But what I'm certain of is that when we do find life, I think it's going to be quite simple. The timescales of history, to me, are still mind-boggling, and I can occasionally manage to quote some of them. But the billions of years of the solar system, of the universe, and then the sort of 3 billion years of life on Mars, on Earth and Mars, indeed, if there's there. Fast forward, and then it's just a 200,000 years of ancestors to humans. And then we're here in this 100-year period, this blink of an eye, where we've actually had technology capable of detecting all of these things and so on. To me, the chances of those overlapping, those time periods overlapping, that in the right place at the right time would be looking at it, that's what I find unlikely. I think we have a lot to learn just from looking at the timescales of history and generally how slowly everything happens.
Yeah, I guess so. But if you really get to be a truly advanced civilization, don't you make sure you remain in existence? I mean, there's an implication if you're say, well, it's much easier to be a simple civilization than one that develops like ours. I don't know. That's a challenge to you, but maybe we're getting to the point that we really should ask some questions of the audience and see what they're interested in. Certainly, this is. I think it looks like we have some questions. So, okay. There's a very good question from Lee. Lee, I think you can be unmuted if you want, if you would like to ask a question. Would you like to, or shall I read it out? Okay, Lee's question is, what would be the next goal after Mars? Now, I think that's probably thinking beyond your lifetime and certainly way beyond mine, but I think it's an interesting question. It's, what do you think, where would you next want to send a team of scientists to work?
And indeed, and you, David, have said a team of scientists, and to me, the answer to that question is it depends what we find and how technology as a whole has developed, and to sort of see who's there. But scientifically, across the solar system, there's all sorts of places still to explore. Will we have the technology to send humans there to go and tap into them themselves? I would be surprised. The reason I think Mars is so appealing is because it is still moderately within the realms of how you could support humans. We can barely send spacecraft to Venus. Never mind spacecraft with a human being in. That would be
unthinkable.
Yes, I just. But by the time we have, if we're talking about humans to Mars and this sort of say natural human instinct in us to push the boundaries and see where do we go next and what do we do, what I think you'll see is by the time we're sending humans to Mars, we will develop increased propulsion technologies, which will end up potentially being able to help us back on Earth if we can keep the Earth still inhabitable for humans. It's the ultimate spaceship, and we need to remember that. And once you've got the technologies to get to Mars, I suspect what I'm really guessing now into the far generations hence. But I imagine, you sort of, again, you get used to the trips to Mars. If we've got the technologies and we find something that's worthwhile and we've really accelerated, by then you'll start sending, things out to the solar system and so on. But I find that absolutely mind-boggling, and it really comes back to me to making sure that we look after our own spaceship, because this is the one that's keeping the whole of humanity alive.
Okay.
And I would far rather us invest, those sorts of, we're going to really invest big time. Let's make sure we invest in looking after this spaceship first, which I think, David, you mentioned advanced civilizations. I'm not convinced that we're going to keep all ourselves alive eventually.
Okay. There's a more sinister question to come next. Judith Walker, do you want to be unmuted to speak?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Richard will speak. Hello? Oh, yeah. My question is, do you worry sometimes that a country, and there are a number of countries that might think this way, might develop a military base on the moon and that military base would allow them to keep other people off, or to decide what other people would be able to do, but would give them command of the moon, and with that would give them command of the space in between moon and Earth. I think that does worry me, and I can think of one country that might be interested in trying for that.
There's a reason that over the last 10, 15 years, you've seen military develop space. The US have got the Space Force, which was done at sort of almost great, many people laughed at it at the time. But the UK has got its own space command. Space has always been military. Even, I mean, and you have to remember that our exploration of space and our development of rockets was born out of military. It was born out of the technology developed for the world wars. So you can't untangle one without the other. What so far we have been really good at doing is keeping space civilian and peaceful. And you go right back to the Outer Space Treaty signed back in the 1960s, and it said that space would be used for peaceful purposes. And you have, like everything, there are people who are considering these things. We've had military satellites up in space for the last, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years, or some of the Skynets are there. There is military presence in space, and you have to protect your space assets because the world is, unfortunately, still not all at peace globally. We have to have people protecting the communications that we use. There are people who are looking at potentially developing space-based solar power. That's one possible technology that could enable us to have clean energy down on Earth. And if we're going to do that, you're going to have to protect it, because what happens if somebody were to wipe out your entire space-based solar power thing, and then you've got no energy? So space is there. When you look at the moon, absolutely, there are people today looking at the moon and considering that. And the space race that the US and China are in, has that sort of, it is unwritten, and it is not publicly spoken about, but you can guarantee in all of the sort of calculations and discussions that that angle is being considered. But space in that way has always been a little bit about FOMO, fear of missing out. Honestly, the moon, what use is the moon to the Earth that you couldn't, that would warrant going all the way to the moon, which is 250,000 miles away, which is really very expensive? Why would you have something on the surface of the moon when you can quite happily have something in geostationary orbit, which is closer, it's easier to get to? I am not convinced. I have no idea. I don't know of all the details. I don't know what they're talking about in all their secret meetings. But I can't imagine why the surface of the moon particularly is worth all that effort, other than, well, you don't want your adversary to go there. The International Space Station is an amazing thing, at one point being considered nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, but it was in the end born out of two adversaries, the US and what was the Soviet Union became Russia, both wanting to do their own space stations. Europe was thinking about doing its own space station, and everybody realized it's so blimmin' expensive to do this. Why don't we just all join together and have a single international space station? And today, that is still there, despite the war that is going on. This is still operating by the two countries because it's completely intertwined. My hope, my ambition, I don't know. My sense is maybe when you look at the moon at the moment and you have the US and China and Europe sitting in the middle trying to work out what it's doing, and Russia as well, if they could afford to, looking at the moon. My sense is that we're still in that place where we were in the 1980s with low Earth orbit and the International Space Station, and everybody wanting a piece, and perhaps maybe one day everybody will work out that it is so expensive and it's so much effort that it is better if we do it peacefully and collaboratively to make sure that we all have a piece of the pie, rather than spending so much money and effort defending it or militarizing it. So that's a long.
I've got somebody called Dee. Can you hear me, Dee? Do you want to put your own question? It's an economic question, and I think almost exactly follows almost counters possibly your argument. Dee, do you want to give your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much, Libby. So yeah, I think it's connected to what you were previously talking about. My question is, do you know how we can ensure that countries don't start laying claim or taking over regions of the moon or Mars?
Well, that outer space treaty that I mentioned, that is an international treaty that's got, I think it's over 150 different signatories on it, including all the spacefaring nations. And it's worth looking up if you haven't seen it. That treaty lays down in international law that no country can own space. So how do we know that countries can't? That law is there. Now, if we start questioning, well, will international law stand and break down? I think it's a whole nother discussion that we will not get into right now. The interesting part comes actually in that outer space treaty of what it doesn't say. It was quite clear it said no country can, but it didn't say anything about individuals or companies. And we're seeing at the minute through the Artemis Accords and discussion more generally is a consent, or people sort of trying to form the consensus and come to the conclusion of, well, what can you do in space and who can own it? And some people would like the moon to remain unowned and just used for science. I say the Antarctica model is a really good model. But the other model that Luxembourg and the US, amongst others, are pushing is a model much more like the high seas. Now, the high seas are not owned by anybody. International treaty is clear. But if you have a licensed boat and are a fisher person, you can go and fish the oceans, and then you can sell your catch. And you don't own them, but you've made money from the resources. And that is where the sort of ownership of the moon is tending towards at the minute. NASA have got a contract out at the minute for someone to sell them some of the moon for $1, because then somebody would own the processed materials, and if you can bring it back and it's worth all that effort to bring it back, someone will own it. And I don't think now, I would be surprised if we can stop that. I think the international consensus has got to the fact that there is useful stuff on the moon. There are people who would like to mine it. There's much talk about lunar economies, which is, again, we could have a long discussion about. In terms of Mars, no one yet is thinking about that. It's still firmly in the scientific sphere, but I can see that being having to be considered sooner. But what we're doing on the moon would be the blueprint, I imagine, for what will end up happening on Mars. But Mars is a really, really long way to have to go and mine things and sell them to somebody else. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, the moon, yeah, it seems to me mining the moon is considerably easier to envisage. So next question is Susan Ann Vine. Susan, would you like to ask your question? You have to unmute.
She says she hasn't got a mic, so I can. Yeah, do you want to read it out, David?
Yes, of course. Very simple question. Will there be a mission to Enceladus?
Oh, I'm sure.
Maybe you need to first explain for everybody what Enceladus is. Here's a test for you, Libby.
No, and then David, this is far more your area, because we're now getting into the science missions of ESA than me. But Enceladus, if I am right, is one of the moons around Saturn. And now I always panic that it's I mean,
you are absolutely right.
Yes.
It's a moon just outside the rings of Saturn. A rather insignificant looking body, but would there be a mission there again, do you think?
Oh, there are people who are planning it now. The reason that Enceladus is interesting to scientists is because as it orbits Saturn, which is a massive giant planet, of course, it gets pushed and pulled by the magnetic field of Saturn, and that is keeping Enceladus warm. And there's thoughts it's got warm oceans and so on. That could be a great place for life. When the Cassini mission reached the end of its life, I say this with some smile, because my very first project at Imperial, when I was a student all those years ago, was looking at the magnetometer data from Cassini as it flew by Jupiter on its way out to Saturn. So so as the Cassini mission came to the end of its life around Saturn, it was specifically dived into Saturn so that it would never accidentally crash into Enceladus and risk contaminating Enceladus, because we think there might be life there. And it was also always interesting because people go, this was a functioning spacecraft. Why killing it now? Why not keep getting all the data? But that was the decision that was made. A controlled end to its life was much, much better than accidentally losing control. And so I am absolutely sure that we will see missions to Enceladus as the European Space Agency, for me, is right now most likely, but we'll see. But NASA, the European Space Agency, somebody somewhere, they will find the funding, and we will see a mission there. But space missions, science missions, this is not something that we'll see tomorrow. It takes decades. It takes years to do the research, the planning, to build the case. Then certainly in the European Space Agency, it can take some years to move all the countries around and decide that this is the right thing to do. And then you have to design the mission and plan it and build it, and that can take 10 years. And then you have to launch it and fly all the way there, and then that can take another 20 years. So we'll see a mission to Enceladus, but I would be surprised if it got there within, any quicker than the next couple of decades.
Okay, I hope that answer wasn't too depressing for you, Susan. But next question is from Asma Sawar. Would you like to ask your question, Asma?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
we can hear you.
Yeah, congratulations for coming on and sharing your experiences with us. I have a tiny thing to say that I have been a part of. I have experience of traveling to space station a few times, and I have been a part of mission from Atlanta cargo mission. So I was a trainee astronaut. I just wanted to say that. And my question is, what is going to be new in Science Museum? Are we going to see modern space technologies on display?
Oh, absolutely. I haven't started the job yet, so it's a little early for me to say. But I will not be doing that job if I was not passionate about space and making sure that it told all of the stories of the amazing history, not just the history that so many people know of NASA and Russia and the Soviet Union, but the UK has got a really rich history in space that I really want to bring out more. But space is so important to everybody's lives every day, and that's something that absolutely needs to be told. And I'm really excited about bringing new missions in, the live data that can be shared all the time. The current space gallery is closing next month in April, and then there will be a small gallery that's opening up at the back of the museum. But I'm really looking forward to working with the Science Museum to make sure that space has a really good home, and I know there's a lot of thought of ambition, and I've got some ideas, so really watch this space.
Okay, I think that actually takes care of Brian Hogan's question, which is a couple down the list. But can I move now to Sue Biddington? Would you like to ask your question, Sue? This will probably be the last question, since I think we have to wrap up by 5. So, Sue.
Oh, this has been fascinating, Libby. Thank you.
Hello?
What risk might they pose for Earth, the astronauts, and how could they be managed?
That's a great question. So your line was breaking up, so I'll repeat it in case anyone didn't hear it. If there are organisms on Mars, what risk would they pose for Earth when astronauts return, and how would they be managed? I'll get to the astronauts in a moment, but I think first I'll tackle the question for the robotic missions that are coming. Right now on Mars, there's a NASA rover called Perseverance, which is collecting rocks, which is drilling in a place called Jezero Crater, which we know had liquid water in the past. And the plan is that those rocks will one day be returned to Earth so that scientists can study those rocks here on Earth. It's a mission called Mars Sample Return. Right now, NASA are working out if they can afford to do it and what the architecture will be. But the plan very much when those rocks do come home is that Mars and Earth never meet. So the rocks will be isolated in Martian atmosphere. It'll be put in a basketball that then seals Mars away from Earth hermetically, and it gets returned. And the rocks will then be placed inside something called a double-walled isolator, which is technology that's been developed here in the UK thanks to UK Space Agency funding. And it's really based on that same technology that everyone uses for Ebola. So if you think back to the terrible Ebola it wasn't a pandemic, but the Ebola outbreaks that happened, you keep the humans, the patients, inside this biosphere so that their atmosphere can't get out. No one minds if Earth gets into that point. But what the technology does is it takes that one-way system and makes it double so that Earth and Mars never get there, and all of the rocks can be looked at by scientists using remote control telescopes and so on to protect Earth. So we are taking serious steps when we look at it scientifically. We bring those rocks back. It's another reason, really and truly, why we need to do this all robotically before we consider sending humans, because you won't be able to completely ever isolate Mars and Earth from each other once you send humans there. You may try and contain the astronauts on Mars. You may find yourself in a really big bubble. What I suspect will happen is that you take all the steps you can on Mars, and then when the astronauts return, I think you would see them do something as the Apollo astronauts did, which is you place them in quarantine, and possibly in a really big double-walled isolator, Ebola-like tent, and so that you really keep them isolated until such time that you're really convinced that they don't pose any risks. But certainly it would be there are many challenges that exist still before we have to overcome to send humans to Mars, and that's just one of them. Radiation, the communications, the propulsion, and all of that would be considered in a mission, because we obviously would want to protect Earth and avoid some great Martian superbug wiping us all out. That would be bad.
I think on that note, I have to bring this conversation, getting a little frightening at the end there, to a close. I apologize, we haven't managed to answer every question raised, but I think you've given a really brilliant overview of where space exploration is, with particular emphasis on why humans should be interested in going there, as well as robots. Really, I've got to thank you very much. And I hope now you're going to be in South Kensington more often, that the Friends of Imperial College can see a bit more of you. That would be really great. I'm sure everybody's really enjoyed. I'd like everybody to unmute and express their appreciation in the usual way. So